Long before the Roanoke colonists vanished, the settlement was already collapsing from the inside. When the English first arrived on the isolated island off the coast of present-day North Carolina, they imagined they were building the foundation of a powerful new English empire in America. But the reality waiting for them was brutal. The soil was poor, supplies were limited, and the settlers were completely unprepared for the unforgiving environment surrounding them. Food spoiled quickly in the humid heat, fresh water became difficult to secure, and disease spread through the crowded wooden settlement faster than anyone expected. Tensions with nearby native tribes grew worse with every passing month as misunderstandings and violent encounters poisoned relationships that the colony desperately depended on for survival. By the time Governor John White prepared to sail back to England for supplies in 1587, fear had already settled over the colony like a storm cloud. The settlers begged him not to leave for long. They knew the situation was becoming dangerous, but nobody could have predicted what would happen next. Just after White returned to England, war exploded between England and Spain. Queen Elizabeth ordered nearly every available ship to remain in Europe to defend against the Spanish Armada. White spent 3 agonizing years trapped overseas, while his colony sat alone in the wilderness with dwindling resources and no protection. Every day he waited. The chances of finding the settlers alive grew smaller. Meanwhile, back in Roanoke, the colonists faced an impossible choice: stay on the island and slowly starve, or abandon the settlement entirely and disappear into an unfamiliar world. And hidden inside White's own journals was a clue that historians would not fully understand for centuries. Before he departed, the settlers had quietly discussed relocating 50 miles inland. At the time, the note seemed insignificant. Today, it may explain everything. But that was only the beginning of the mystery. For more than 400 years, historians believe the Roanoke mystery had reached a dead end. The island had been searched repeatedly. Theories came and went, and the fate of the settlers slowly transformed into one of America's greatest unsolved legends. Then, in 2012, a single map changed the entire investigation. Inside the British Museum, researchers were carefully re-examining a fragile watercolor map created by John White himself during the 16th century. The document, known as La Virginea Pars, had already been studied countless times by historians. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, but under specialized backlighting used to reveal hidden markings and edits, researchers noticed something strange beneath a tiny patch of paper attached to the map centuries earlier. Hidden underneath was the faint outline of a square-shaped fort. It had been deliberately concealed. The symbol marked a location approximately 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, near the convergence of major rivers deep within the Carolina mainland. Suddenly, White's old journal entry about moving inland no longer sounded like a random idea. It looked like a real evacuation plan. Historians began to suspect White himself had hidden the fort symbol to protect the colony's relocation site from Spanish spies who were actively hunting English settlements in the Americas. This discovery electrified archaeologists because it suggested the colonists never intended to stay on Roanoke permanently. The abandoned settlement may not have been the scene of a tragedy at all. It may have been part of a carefully planned escape. The map stopped being a historical artifact and became something much more dangerous, a survival blueprint hidden in plain sight for centuries. And once researchers realized where to look, they began uncovering evidence buried beneath the Carolina soil that completely transformed the story everyone thought they knew. Archaeologists searching the Carolina mainland understood one important fact from the very beginning. After 400 years, they were never going to find standing buildings or wooden walls. Time destroys wood, weather erases roads, and entire settlements can disappear beneath forests. So, instead of searching for structures, researchers focused on the tiny objects people leave behind without thinking. Broken pottery, rusted tools, fragments of everyday life buried silently underground. At a remote location known simply as Site X in Bertie County, those forgotten objects finally began to tell a story. Hidden near what was once a Native American village, archaeologists uncovered fragments of distinctly English pottery dating back to the late 1500s. Among the discoveries were pieces of Surrey, Hampshire borderware, a type of green-glazed English ceramic commonly used during the Elizabethan era. The findings immediately caught attention because these items appeared decades earlier than the Jamestown settlement. But strangely, something important was missing. Archaeologists found no clay tobacco pipes anywhere at the site. At first, that sounds insignificant, but to historians, it became one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the entire case. Jamestown settlers who arrived in 1607 were obsessed with tobacco, and their settlements are filled with discarded pipe fragments. The complete absence of those pipes at Site X created a perfect historical fingerprint, placing the site before Jamestown's arrival. These weren't random English travelers. They were likely connected directly to the Roanoke colonists. Skeptics initially argued that Site X may have only been a temporary camp or a scouting location, but recent excavations uncovered evidence of a second inland site nearby, now called Site Y. Suddenly, the theory became impossible to ignore. The settlers had not simply vanished. They had moved inland in organized groups and established new communities, hidden far from the coast. What once looked like a supernatural disappearance was beginning to resemble something far more human, a desperate migration into the unknown. But another clue from the abandoned colony would lead researchers in an entirely different direction. For centuries, the word carved into the Roanoke fort entrance terrified historians because nobody truly understood what it meant. Croatoan. The mysterious inscription was the only clue John White found when he returned to the abandoned settlement in 1590. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, and no desperate messages scattered through the empty colony. Just that single word cut carefully into wood. Over time, the name transformed into legend. Some believed it was a warning. Others thought it was a coded message left behind moments before disaster struck. But in reality, Croatoan was not a secret code at all. It was a real place. Croatoan was the name used for Hatteras Island and the native tribe living there. Unlike some neighboring groups, the Croatan people had friendly relations with the English settlers. That detail suddenly changed the entire meaning behind the carving. Instead of signaling danger, the word may have been pointing toward survival. For generations, oral histories passed down among native descendants claimed the settlers had integrated with local tribes rather than disappearing. Mainstream historians dismissed these stories for decades, treating them as folklore rather than evidence. But during the 2024 and 2025 excavation seasons, archaeologists uncovered discoveries that forced many experts to reconsider everything. On Hatteras Island, researchers found English and Native American artifacts buried together in the same living areas. European metal objects, fragments of weapons, copper items, and English tools were discovered alongside native pottery and food remains. The arrangement of the objects told a remarkable story. This was not a battlefield. It was a shared settlement where two cultures were living side by side. The evidence painted a vivid picture of starving colonists abandoning their English identity and relying on indigenous communities to survive the brutal conditions of the New World. Suddenly, the word Croatoan no longer sounded mysterious. It sounded practical. It may have simply been the colonists telling White exactly where they had gone. But the most shocking proof of all would come not from artifacts or maps, but from the DNA of living people still walking the American South today. Even after the archaeological discoveries, many historians still wanted stronger proof that the Roanoke colonists survived and blended into local populations. Artifacts can be debated, maps can be interpreted differently, but DNA is much harder to dismiss. That realization led to one of the most fascinating investigations connected to the Lost Colony, the Lost Colony DNA Project. Using modern genetic genealogy, researchers began comparing the DNA of present-day families in the Carolinas with surviving records from the original 1587 colonists. The results stunned investigators. Scientists focused on Y chromosomes, mitochondrial DNA, and autosomal markers capable of tracing family ancestry across centuries. Slowly, patterns began emerging that pointed directly back to Tudor-era England. One of the most compelling discoveries involved a participant known publicly only as Mr. Brown. Genetic testing revealed that his Y DNA matched a specific English lineage dating back to the Elizabethan period. Even more remarkable, the genetic signature aligned with the surnames of two known Roanoke settlers listed on the original colony manifest, Henry and William Brown. After more than 4 centuries of silence, it appeared that descendants of the lost colonists were still alive. The implications were enormous. It suggested the settlers did not die out completely. Their bloodlines survived by merging into surrounding communities and indigenous populations over generations. Combined with the evidence from Hatteras Island and the inland settlements, the DNA findings created a powerful new narrative. The colony had not disappeared overnight in some horrifying massacre. It had slowly dissolved into the landscape of early America until the original English identity became almost impossible to recognize. Historians spent centuries searching for ruins, graves, or signs of destruction because they assumed the colony ended in tragedy. Instead, the evidence now points toward adaptation, intermarriage, and survival. The settlers may have escaped death not by defending their English way of life, but by abandoning it entirely. And that possibility changes the meaning of the Roanoke mystery forever. The deeper researchers dig into the Roanoke mystery, the more unsettling the real story becomes. For centuries, the traditional version of American history portrayed early English colonists as conquerors pushing into a wild and dangerous land while building permanent European settlements. Roanoke completely disrupts that narrative. The evidence now suggests the colonists failed almost immediately when isolated from England's protection and supplies. Instead of conquering the New World, they were overwhelmed by it. Starvation, disease, fear, and abandonment stripped away the illusion of English superiority. Faced with extinction, the settlers appear to have made a decision that history was never prepared to tell honestly. They adapted. They relied on native tribes for food, shelter, survival skills, and protection. They blended into indigenous communities so thoroughly that later generations no longer recognized them as separate people. In many ways, the lost colony was only lost because historians were searching for Englishmen who remained English. They expected forts, churches, weapons, and royal banners. What they failed to imagine was that survival itself may have required the settlers to let all of that go. The descendants of Roanoke may have lived for generations inside native societies, while European historians continued writing stories about mysterious disappearances and supernatural endings. That idea transforms Roanoke from a ghost story into something much more human and far more emotional. John White likely never understood that his family may have survived. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, may have grown up speaking different languages, living among different people, and raising children in a completely transformed world. The colony did not vanish in darkness. It evolved into something history refused to recognize. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that the truth sat hidden in oral traditions, forgotten maps, buried artifacts, and living bloodlines for over 400 years, while the world obsessed over myths of disappearance. The lost colony was never truly gone. We were simply searching for the wrong ending all along.